Hello there, Conan55 back again, bringing you our next review. Today's topic of choice is the infamous Resident Evil Survivor, well regarded as one of the worst entries in the franchise. So let's dive in and see if there's anything redeemable in this entry. The development of the game was handled by Capcom Production Studio 3. Originally called Biohazard Gun Survivor Behind the Mask, and shown off at the autumn 1999 Tokyo Game Show. Originally intended as a light gun game, the American version had its light gun compatibility removed because Columbine had happened earlier that year, and American media was heavily blaming the incident on video games as the source of learning how to use firearms and influencing their violent behavior. As a cost-cutting measure, a lot of assets were reused from Resident Evil 2, and even the Hunter from Resident Evil 1 was reused. You are Ark Thompson, a detective with amnesia. You don't know what's going on, but you push onward as you quickly learn the city you are in is falling to pieces. Push onward. Escape this hellscape, and recover your memories of who you are and why you are there. The game is played in a first-person perspective, like a House of the Dead. Because of the first-person shooter nature, there is localized damage. Hitting certain parts does do more damage to your foe. You travel from room to room exploring and looking for keys, journals, weapons, and ammo. Most of the time, the key to open a path is literally in the side room off of the room you're searching in, so searching for specific doors is almost non-existent. There is pretty much no backtracking in this game. There's many points where you're not even allowed to go back. Many rooms will continuously replenish enemies each time you enter them. A positive of the game is it does feature branching pathways, which determine who you meet and how the story unfolds. And as you are expected to complete the game in a fairly short amount of time, you can easily go back and do things in a different order. There is no save system. If you die, you have 4 continues that you can use. The controls are clunky and slow. Movement is very inconvenient, and due to the American version, which is the version I have, not having GunCon support, aiming is a chore. The one benefit of the aiming is once you shoot an enemy, the reticle locks onto them and you can keep firing. A quirk of the game is if you're not looking directly at something, most of the time it cannot hurt you. The stiff controls are further compounded by tanky enemies that leap in front of you like the Hunter, repeatedly to block your escape. Almost every enemy but 2 is pretty much ripped from Resident Evil 2 or Resident Evil 1, with minor alterations at best. There is 13 enemies within the game, but only 2 of them are unique creatures and models. The 2 unique models being the Undertakers and the final boss. The Undertakers are basically a BOW that moves like a gorilla, screams like a jaguar, and it melts upon its death. They are Umbrella's response to outbreaks without endangering their precious employees. They are led by a human commander, and the final boss is a unique tyrant which actually looks pretty interesting. This is another sore point of the game. You really don't feel immersed in it. The soundtrack, while excellent, does its job too well. A lot of the time, the music is actiony. You expect to hit a large amount of resistance, and it turns out to be 3 or 4 zombies ruining the build-up. This is the highlight of the entire game. The soundtrack within is stellar. Many of the tunes are pleasant to listen to and get the blood pumping. Several of the tracks I enjoyed to the point I found myself listening to them as I typed up this review. This is probably the one thing I can honestly recommend this game for. Sound assets of gunshots and monsters are reused from Resident Evil 1 and 2 for whichever respective monster it is, with the exception of the two unique ones. The graphics are about the same as Resident Evil 2, but the first person's perspective really exposes the pixelated models and makes the models themselves seem a lot more stiff and bulky. There is a large variety of areas and they all look fairly different. The large variety does help add to the fact that you're in a city and not just a mansion or some remote area in the middle of nowhere. Resident Evil Survivor is a very flawed game. It wants to be a shooter, but it doesn't have the pacing, instead trying to keep the slower pace style of the original Resident Evils. The lack of gun-con support makes an already underwhelming experience just that little bit more irritating. The graphics also do not suit the first-person style, looking quite bland and underwhelming at times. This chiefly being the fact that most of the models stick out severely. Compare this to House of the Dead, a game from 1996, but was built from the ground up in a first-person shooter experience, looks substantially better than this game, which was released in 2000. The controls are slow, especially in menus, clunky and awkward to use, and are very stiff, making just going through the game a chore at times, especially in crowded rooms. The overall atmosphere is also lacking. You feel more like you're running from room to room, from floating item to floating item, instead of getting into the mood. Here we are at the end of yet another review. So how exactly do I feel about Survivor? Well, it's a very mixed bag, honestly. This game has so many glaring faults with it that at times it's hard to pick out the things it did right. The controls and a lack of atmosphere are severe areas of failure. The enemies themselves are fine, but they're all just reused from Resident Evil 1 and 2 outside of the sweeper and final boss. The graphics are a mixed bag as well. On the one hand, the large variety of environments are a welcome addition, but the monster models look quite bad in the first-person perspective and really don't do the game justice. The story is forgettable and the voice acting is about at Resident Evil 1 standards instead of the more polished acting of 2 and 3. The one area of praise is the soundtrack. I honestly do love the various themes within the game, as unfitting at points as they are. So let's wrap this up, shall we? Honestly, Survivor is a game I cannot recommend as a buy, as it just has too many flaws. If you can find a way to rent it in this day and age, or if it's cheaper than like $10, then sure, I'd say take a stab at it, but don't waste a bunch of money on a forgettable experience. If you want a better FPS experience with an old school Resident Evil feeling, go play Dead Aim. It's much better than this game, even though it's still a flawed experience. This has been Core955, reviewing Resident Evil Survivor, and I'm signing off.